52-year-old Texas resident, Karen Davis, got married, and then after the ceremony and after the honeymoon, she went through the process of changing her last name from Davis to McBride to match her husband's last name. After the change was done, the last step was to get a new driver's license with the new name on it. So Karen emailed the local DMV to set up a time for her to come in and make the change to her license. But after she sent that email, the local DMV immediately emailed Karen back, and they told her that they could not help her with this request until she resolved an issue. They very cryptically said it had something to do with the state of Oklahoma. And then at the bottom of the email, there was just a phone number they told her she needed to call in order to resolve this issue. She punched this number the DMV had given her into her phone, and then she let it ring. A few moments later, a woman from the Norman, Oklahoma District Attorney's Office picked up the phone and said, "How can I help you?" Karen told her, "Hey, I was just trying to get a new license in Texas. They told me there was some sort of issue. I don't know what it is, but this is the number they gave me." The woman from the DA's office discovered Karen's so-called Oklahoma problem. And after she explained to Karen what this enormous problem was, Karen literally couldn't believe it. Suddenly, everything in Karen's life made sense. For the last 22 years, Karen, who was incredibly smart and friendly and polite and never had a problem with anyone, had an incredibly hard time getting a job. Even jobs that she was extremely qualified for, she would get turned down for someone who was way less qualified. And then, in the rare times that Karen did actually get hired, she would always get fired for no reason. And so Karen never understood why she was being treated this way until now. It would turn out 22 years earlier, which is when Karen's hireability issues began, she lived in Norman, Oklahoma. She lived with a roommate. And this roommate was this nice young man who had a couple of young kids. And one weekend, he went to the local movie store called Movie Place, and he rented the hit 90s movie, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, to watch with his kids. And after he was done watching this movie, he didn't return the VHS tape of Sabrina the Teenage Witch back to Movie Place. When Sabrina the Teenage Witch was not returned in a timely fashion, they pressed charges against the card holder. And the card holder was Karen Davis. The roommate had just borrowed her card. And somehow, these charges against Karen were never brought up to Karen. She was never contacted by anyone, and so for 22 years, she was technically a wanted felon for felony embezzlement. And so this was the reason she kept not getting jobs and kept getting fired from jobs. Karen worked with the Norman, Oklahoma DA's office and got these charges dismissed. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, which includes some incredibly resilient microbial organisms, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly hot. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blackened. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail, if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. On June 7, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, "Do not leave the boardwalk." They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. Corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose $1,500. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic. And if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. There was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. When that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. And the two men opened the side to the oven, and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven, and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, hey, it's really hot in here. And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, no, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. By the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. On the morning of September 10th, 1987, Police Constable Dick Ellis walked into an interview room in a police station in South Yorkshire, England. Inside of this room was a table, and sitting on the other side of this table were these two security guards. One was named Stephen Brooks, and the other was named David Goldthorpe. He could tell they were both visibly shaken. These two security guards just launched into this totally crazy sounding story. The men told Ellis that the night before, they had been patrolling this construction site where workers were building a 6-mile stretch of highway and bridge that were called the Stocks Bridge Bypass. They saw clearly there was a figure standing on this bridge, and he appeared to be staring down below the bridge. One of them lifts up his flashlight and shines it at this man. The beam of light appears to just go through this man's body. The figure appeared to kind of turn and look at David and Stephen, and they were so unsettled and terrified by it, they just turned and ran, and they went to the police. After PC Ellis had been told this story, he did not believe in any way that what they had experienced was supernatural. Ellis looks at these two guys and he's like, this is not a police matter. Why don't you guys go talk to the church or something? Later that day, Ellis got a call from his boss being like, hey, did you tell two security guards who came in here to go talk to the church? They are currently at the local church and they are refusing to leave unless the church helps them. He finds these two guys who are still totally shaken up, and Ellis is like, guys, I will tonight go to the bridge. I will check it out if you leave the church. And they left the church. And so that night, around midnight, PC Ellis and his partner drove over to the construction site. Now, at first, nothing happened on this bridge, when suddenly he's hit with this unbelievably cold gust of air. And then at the same time, Ellis began feeling this incredible pressure on his chest. He found himself
slowly turning and looking out his open window, and right there is this man. He screams and gets his partner's attention, and then he pushes open his door and he jumps out to confront this person who snuck up on them, but there's no one outside the car. And so Ellis, he turns to his partner and he's like, hey, did you just see what I just saw? And Ellis's partner, who's totally ashen-faced, just looks at Ellis and he's like, yeah. And he would tell Ellis that at some point he had turned and seen the guy standing there, and the guy, he was wearing this old coat, crouched down just enough that he was looking in the car, but the guy, he had no face. Ultimately, Ellis and his partner would file a report, but they would simply describe it as inexplicable phenomenon. Shortly after filing that report, the construction was finished. Right away, people started dying on that bridge. In tandem with all the fatal accidents were all the independently reported sightings of this dark figure standing on the bridge that had no face. The leading theory is that the construction of this bridge and the highway disturbed a gravesite. The two security guards both quit their jobs. As for Ellis and his partner, they've never found a reasonable explanation for what they saw.
Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. There is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. It will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, they made their way out to this bridge. They are amazed at the number of people who are already in line waiting to jump off of it. They've been forced to wait for a really long time, and this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic, but she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reach the front of the line, and they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked, and then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. Her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine, but when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who are already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's gonna go through with this. And so several hours went by by, this totally high-stress, anxious waiting period, and then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready, and the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked, she doesn't think this is fun at all, she just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car, and when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who are already in line waiting to jump off of it. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time, and this whole time they're watching other people jump, and Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do, and so she was beginning to second guess her decision. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's gonna go through with this. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who are already in line waiting to jump off of it. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them, and Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do, and so she was beginning to second guess her decision. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's gonna go through with this. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, and so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform, so they're looking out over this ravine, and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision, her heart is racing, she's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. One of the staff members finally says, "Okay, jump." And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, "Okay, jump," was talking to her boyfriend. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. Her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge, he leapt over the railing, and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down. The fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In 2017, Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit. He left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon and moved into this commune. But shortly after moving in, Aaron got restless again and began traveling all over the United States. And so he left the United States and he went to Nepal and began traveling all over Nepal. He met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina, and the two fell madly in love. In 2014, the pair got married and they bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust reared its head again, and he settled on attending that year's Burning Man. And he goes back to Oregon in the United States, and he meets up with a very close friend of his named Justin. From there, they drive in Justin's big van. They get to Nevada, they drive out to the Burning Man site. And so by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had made lots of new friends, and they were out partying and dancing. Towards the end of every Burning Man, they will build this 40-foot tall wooden man effigy and they will burn it to the ground. And so on the night, their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. All around this wooden man are what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event that also have some fire training. Aaron would turn to Justin and say, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy and I'm gonna go see them right now." And a little while later, when the sun had gone down, they lit the effigy. And so this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames and everyone's so amazed by it. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begin to disperse. Someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin and frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that happened to Aaron. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd, and he made his way over to that far side of the crowd, but we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland Switzerland, and once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd, and then after the effigy was set alight, at some point, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive effigy, right into the fire. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the Rangers were able to go inside and pull him out. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night. Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the Burning Man, and so it was determined that his death had to be a... However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit, especially like this. At this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Here is a picture one of the bystanders took of Aaron as he charges into the fire.
In the summer of 1974, a 60-year-old doctor named Julian Kirchik sat beside his backyard pool at his home in Old Westbury, New York. He was a surgeon at a local hospital, and he also had a wife and 4 children. It was not often he got a moment of peace to himself. And when all of a sudden, he heard something rustle in the bushes nearby. This rustling sound persisted. Eventually, Dr. Kirchik did open his eyes, and he got up out of his chair to go see what was going on. He gets up and he takes a few steps when he suddenly freezes. He sees there is someone standing in the bushes. A person. The person was wearing what appeared to be this dark, long robe that covered their whole body. And in fact, the robe kind of obscured their face. And as he's standing there transfixed, this person in the robe extends one of their arms, this long, skinny arm, and kind of begins to beckon Dr. Kirchik towards them. Dr. Kirchik went from being sort of startled to being terrified. This figure basically looked like the Grim Reaper. He blinks for a second and the man is gone. Over the next few days, Dr. Kirchik obsessed over what he had just seen. But Dr. Kirchik, he's a surgeon. He's a man of science and reason, and he can't understand how this could have happened. Even if it was just a hallucination, it was so vivid. For months, Dr. Kirchik just carried this incredible weight with him everywhere he went, like this constant sense of unease, until October of 1974. Dr. Kirchik suddenly got sick. He had a fever and it just wouldn't go away. He went to his own doctor for a checkup and his doctor told him, "I got some bad news." That day, Dr. Kirchik was diagnosed with an incurable form of blood cancer. This sort of felt like a validation of what he'd already seen. Death, the Grim Reaper, had been calling him. Now, Dr. Kirchik knew why. Dr. Kirchik would share his story with newspapers, which is how we know about it today. And shortly after sharing his story, Dr. Kirchik would die.
In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the mountains. 7 days in and some bad weather forced them to make camp about halfway up a mountain. The last pictures of them alive were taken at this campsite. When the hikers never showed up, they sent out a search party who quickly found their campsite, and it was immediately apparent that something horrible had happened to them. All their tents had been slashed open, but from the inside, and inside the tents was all their gear, neatly folded and stacked inside the remains of the tents. No bodies, but 9 sets of footprints walking away from the camp. Using the footprints, they discovered 5 hikers who were only dressed in underwear who had died of hypothermia. They found the other 4 hikers 250 feet away in a riverbed wearing the clothes of their dead hiker friends. They had skull fractures, chest fractures, eyes, tongue, lips missing, and their bodies were radioactive. Official cause of death? Unknown compelling force. In 2006, a group of cave divers decided they wanted to film a documentary in one of the most dangerous caves in the world. But only a few hours into their descent, and a freak storm erupts on land, collapsing the entrance to the cave. In order to avoid the huge falling rocks that were coming off the ceiling, they were forced to swim through one of the uncharted sections of the cave. After they'd been diving for over an hour, they luckily come across this island in the middle of a tunnel, where they set up camp and wait to be rescued. After 48 hours and no sign of a rescue, the cameraman actually starts filming in case they don't make it out of there. At the same time, one of their crew members does something very stupid. 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall until he reached the trash chute. He dropped his trash bag inside, he closed the trash chute, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. But all along the way, there was no phone phone on the ground. Maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. One of his neighbors walked out into the hall, and the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. The manager was waiting for a very important phone call, and so couldn't really leave his office, and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. One of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room. They go to the trash room and they try the door, and it's unlocked. Right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. They also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After Roger got that key from the manager, there was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up and he looked down into the tunnel. And as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. This was a trash compactor. His body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. But there was no ladder inside this tunnel, and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. There was nowhere for him to go, and so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public. January 12th, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm gonna be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. His phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't, and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine and he just left. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by 2 people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. You would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up, but his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. Dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. As a result, we may never know the truth. In 1995, 37-year-old Jeannie Hesselschwert was living with her fiancé, Mike Monahan, in Arlington, Massachusetts. In July of that year, Jeannie and Mike left for a planned trip to Yosemite National Park in California to go backpacking and sightseeing. And about 2 hours into this drive, there was this turnout on the side of the road where a couple of other tourists were standing and sightseeing, and Jeannie and Mike decided they wanted to pull over. Mike said he wanted to walk down the trail a little ways to this area that apparently was good for bird watching. And Jeannie didn't want to do that. She wanted to walk in the other direction up to this overlook. And so they decided that they would each get to do their own activities. They'd be gone for 15 minutes and then meet back at the car. So Mike heads down and does his bird watching, and then after 15 minutes, he walks back up to the car expecting to see Jeannie, but she's not there. And this is 1995. Neither of them had a cell phone, and he starts walking up the trail to see if he can find her. But he realizes the trail immediately spiders off in different directions, and so at this point he decides, I have to get authorities involved. The search for Jeannie would become the largest in Yosemite's history, expanding to 40 square miles. After 2 weeks of looking everywhere for her, the only thing they were able to find were 2 boot prints that they believed belonged to Jeannie. The first print was found in the vicinity of where their car was parked, and then the other one was curiously located on a trail that was one of the biggest trails in Yosemite. 2 months after Jeannie went missing, 2 men were in this really remote section of Yosemite to go fishing when they spotted a human body in a pool of water. It would turn out to be Jeannie's. She was 3 miles from where she was last seen by Mike at that trailhead. She was only wearing socks and 1 boot, and she had been sitting in this pool of water for so long that they were unable to determine a cause of death. Initially, it was speculated that she must have fallen into the river that fed ultimately down to where she was found, but park officials said there's too many debris along this waterway that her body would never have been able to get down to this spot. But if she didn't drift to that spot, it meant she had to have gotten there on foot. The only way to get there is to climb up a cliff with climbing gear on. The next theory was, okay, she must have been abducted and they brought her here. That means your assailant would have had to carry Jeannie down this 2,000-foot cliff, which also seems really unrealistic. The most widely accepted theory was put forth by a tracker that was involved in this case. They went out and they surveyed the area where Jeannie would have been, and they noticed that the sound the wind made when it passed by this particular clump of aspen trees, it sounded like a car driving by. And so they speculated that maybe Jeannie, she's scared and she hears this sound and she thinks she's hearing a road. And so she would have walked towards the sound of the car, which really was the leaves. She could have potentially wound up at the side of that cliff, and then she could have slipped and fallen over the edge. But park officials and authorities were a little bit skeptical of this theory. It was almost like she would have had to leap off the cliff to land in that stretch of water. But park officials and authorities, they don't have a better theory. In fact, no one has a better theory. We're just left with a lot of questions. Night of February 19, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel in southern Mexico. It was finally nearing the end of Paula's shift. Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone and checked it. And she saw there was a text message from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And then just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. He waved to his mom and said, hey, I parked my motorbike just down the street. Whenever you're ready, we can leave. Paula, she walked over, she gave him a kiss and a hug, and then she began gathering her things. Her son absolutely loved his motorbike, was always looking for an excuse to ride it. That was why he was so eager to give his mom a ride home. She and her son walked out the front doors of the hotel to where Miguel always parked his bike whenever he picked his mom up from work. When they turned the corner and looked at the spot, his bike wasn't there. Miguel became convinced that someone must have stolen his bike. But Miguel still had the keys to his motorcycle, which meant whoever had stolen it had likely hotwired it. And since that takes quite a bit of time to pull off components of the bike and kind of fiddle around with the wires to make it start, Miguel was thinking maybe they're still in the area. Let's go look for them and get the bike back. The city in southern Mexico was called San Cristobal de las Casas. It was a very dangerous place, full of lots of street crime and violence and gangs that used the area as a hotspot for drug trafficking. But Paula and Miguel, they knew this. They lived there. Paula and Miguel began running down these side streets, looking all over the place for Miguel's bike. They're running around, and then finally they turn a corner and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Miguel and Paula begin charging down the road, and Miguel actually gets in front of this guy and stops him. And then Paula, she joins her son and she starts screaming at him as well and taking videos and pictures. And then as this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up behind Paula and Miguel. And as they did, Paula and Miguel heard the sound of the engine and they turned around, ground, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a gun, aiming it at her son, Miguel, right at his chest. Her motherly instincts kicked in and she leapt in front of her son. Not knowing what else to do, she raised her phone and took a picture. And then seconds later, there was a loud bang. This guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike gave it up. He dropped the bike. He took off running down the road, and the gunman, he too turned his bike around and sped off down the road. Paula was on the ground because a second after she took that photo, the gunman had shot her in the chest. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning, orphaning Miguel and his 3 siblings. However, the photo that Paula took of her killer seconds before he killed her was such a high-quality photo showing his face that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice, and they were both arrested. 4 p.m. on Saturday, October 26th, 2019, a 56-year-old woman named Pamela Krymeyer was hanging out in her son's backyard in Knoxville, Iowa. She was there with her son and his wife, who was expecting a child, along with some other relatives, to have a gender reveal party. And Pamela could not have been more excited. Pamela worked full-time as an assistant at a U.S. Army base nearby. But to her, that was just a job. That was not like her identity. Where Pamela really put all her energy was her family. She really identified as a mom and a wife and a grandmother. And she was so excited to find out if her new grandchild was going to be a boy or a girl. Pamela's son finally signaled to the group that it was time to get started. Pamela pulled out her phone to film this because she wanted to make sure she saved this moment for future generations. Pamela's son and his pregnant wife walked towards the middle of the yard where there was this device that was set up. And then Pamela's son turns away from the crowd and he kind of leans over this device, he does something to it, and then he and his wife backed up along the fence line with the other relatives before anybody could see any color. There was this deafening booming sound, and then for Pamela, everything went black. A split second later, the backyard was absolute chaos as people screamed and called out to call 911. It would turn out the device in the middle of the backyard that was going to be used to reveal whether the baby was a boy or a girl was a homemade device. Basically, it was like the cylinder that Pamela and her son and family had made that basically would fire off either pink or blue powder. Except the tube that the powder sat inside of was metal, and then what they were using to basically shoot the powder out was gunpowder. So they basically packed gunpowder into a metal tube, sealed it off, and then attached a fuse to the gunpowder. When Pamela's son went and lit the fuse, he had lit, effectively, a pipe bomb. And then when the fuse ignited the gunpowder, the metal tubing exploded and sent shards of metal up to 400 feet away. And one particular piece of metal shard went right at Pamela and into her head. When first responders showed up in the backyard, they saw a scene that was absolute chaos. Holes in the fence, holes in the house, metal everywhere, and Pamela lying up against the fence on the ground. Pamela was the only fatality. And because it was ultimately ruled an accident, no one faced criminal charges. In 1988, 35-year-old Ivan McGuire was an experienced skydiving instructor with over 700 jumps to his name. On April 5th of that year, he was working in North Carolina, and he was tasked with filming other instructors and their students after they jumped out of the plane. The way this worked is Ivan would go up in the plane with the instructor and their student, and Ivan would be the first to leap out of the plane. He would roll onto his back, and he would film upward towards the plane, and he would capture the student and instructor jumping out, and Ivan would continue to film them until they pulled their chutes, at which point he would pull his. The filming equipment that Ivan was using was much larger and more cumbersome than something you would use today. He had a voice-activated camera attached to his helmet, and then from there was a cord going to this big heavy VHS deck that he kept in a backpack. Ivan went up with the first student and instructor and successfully filmed their jump. When he got back on the ground, Ivan went over to the riggers and he gave them his parachute so they could pack it for him, and then Ivan went over to a bench and began fiddling with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's second jump of the day with a new instructor and new student, he was so preoccupied with fiddling with his camera that he forgot to grab his parachute. And so he ran over to the plane and he's about to get on, and they say, "Hey, Ivan, you're not wearing a parachute." He runs back over, he gets his parachute, he loads back in the plane, it all goes great, he makes it to the ground, and his second jump is a success. Ivan takes off his parachute, he gives it to the riggers, and then he goes and sits down on a bench and continues to fidget and fiddle around with his camera equipment. When it was time for Ivan's third jump of the day, this time he grabbed his parachute, put all of his gear on, ran over to the plane, hopped on board, and he took off. Once they got up to their jumping altitude, which was 10,500 feet, Ivan turned on his camera. The jump master towards the front of the plane slides open the side door. Ivan, who's going to be the first one out, makes his way to the edge. Once they're ready, Ivan falls out backwards and continues to film. You see the instructor and student jump out right afterwards. Ivan continues to film them as they go down, and then you see the instructor and student pull their parachutes, at which time Ivan reaches back to pull his own, but he he can't find it. And he's trying to reach for his ripcord, and then he realizes what's happened. That parachute he grabbed before he loaded up in the plane was not a parachute. He grabbed his heavy backpack that had that big VHS deck in it. He mistook it for the parachute. And so now, falling at terminal velocity with no way to stop himself, he begins yelling out, "Oh no, oh God, no!" And he keeps reaching back as if he's just gonna find this cord, but there's nothing there. And after a few agonizing seconds, you see the ground getting closer and closer and closer, and then it cuts out. Ivan's body was later found about 1.5 miles outside of the drop zone in the woods. His camera and videotape were severely damaged, but they were able to splice it together, and that's why we know what happened in his final moments. An investigation into his death showed the pilot made the same mistake Ivan did. When he saw Ivan with that backpack on, he assumed it was a parachute, and so ultimately Ivan's death was ruled an accident. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. What had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar, and Isaac had come to that bar, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, and after that, they became totally inseparable. But despite how well everything was going, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all three people, the pilot and the two people in back, they all died on impact. And everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day. He remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. Put his headphones on, and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the three people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend.
Snowy morning in 1972, 22-year-old Sotria Kritsonis sat at her bus stop in Seattle, Washington, adjusting her knit cap against the cold. The hat actually still felt pretty weird on her head because just a few days earlier, she had cut her brown hair super short. In fact, she'd deliberately worn this big hat to hide her haircut because this would make the reveal to her friends at school that much better. She glanced up Rayner Avenue for any sign of her bus, but there wasn't one. The city's public transportation system was all out of whack that day because of the weather. She'd already missed her first class of the day because of this bus, and now she was in danger of missing her second class. That's when she heard the beep of a car horn, and a pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle rolled up to the curb right in front of her. Tria had to squint through the snow, but she could see the silhouette of a man and kind of waving her over. Curious, she walked up to the now open window and leaned in. He was a good-looking guy in his 20s. He explained that he'd actually been driving on Rayner Ave for a while. He hadn't seen a bus in a long time. He offered to give Sotria a ride to her school. This is the 1970s, and hitchhiking at the time was pretty common. She agreed to get in because she knew knew was her best chance at making it to school for her second class, and she was freezing. Tria sat back in the seat, and as she did, she looked out her window at the familiar route passing by. When she heard him turn on his blinker, he was preparing to turn right. And this struck Tria as odd, because as she had explained to him, her school was a straight shot down Rainer Ave, and saw they were about to merge onto Interstate 5, which was definitely not the way to Tria's school. She opened her mouth, but he cut her off, and he looked at her and he said, "It's a terrible idea to take a ride from a stranger." The man kept on talking, but Tria was not listening at all. Instead, she was fixated on what he was doing with his right hand. He was fishing for something underneath his seat. Without taking her eyes off of this man, she traced with her hand and felt for the door handle, but she couldn't feel it. And then she turned and realized there was no door handle. It had been removed. Just then, the man stopped rummaging around underneath his seat. Whatever he was looking for, he had found it. But then, something strange happened. The man's face changed from determined and almost cruel to confused. The man told Tria to take off her hat. With trembling hands, she did as she was instructed, although she had no idea why he was asking. And when the hat was off her head, the man looked shocked, and he dropped whatever it was he had found back under his seat. There was a long, tense silence, and when the man finally spoke, he just said, "Why did you cut your hair?" The man immediately got off the highway and drove fast to Tria's school. When they got there, he opened up the door for her and told Tria to get out and said she was lucky. A few years later, in 1975, Tria was watching TV when she saw a familiar face come onto the screen. It was the man who had given her a ride, being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Tria dropped everything and turned up the volume, and what she heard made her numb with horror. Because the newscaster was saying that this man who had given her a ride was a suspected serial killer accused of murdering dozens of young women who he would lure into his pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle and then bludgeon them to death with a crowbar or tire iron. And he had a very specific type when it came to identifying his victims. They were young women who all had long brown hair. This man's name was Ted Bundy.
On the afternoon of April 22nd, 2023, 49-year-old father of three named Carl O'Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. This particular cave he wasn't that familiar with. He'd only been here a couple other times, but Carl wasn't remotely worried because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that often people showed up with their kids. Carl continued crawling through this tunnel, and eventually he reached this T intersection. So he decides, okay, I'll just go right. He started to feel like the walls around him were kind of shrinking. He reached a dead end. Carl decided he would make a U-turn with his body and go back the way he came, leading with his head and his upper body. Gets his head and his shoulders and his upper half kind of folded around until they're looking back in the direction he was coming, but he was too physically big to get his lower half to complete the U-turn. And so he was effectively wedged in this U-shaped position. And so he decides, okay, let's reset. I'll pull my shoulders and my upper body back and I'll reset facing the dead end. When he tried pulling his upper body and his head and his shoulders back, he realized he was also stuck going in that direction. He was stuck in this U-shape and couldn't go anywhere. Carl is telling himself that it's gonna be okay. This is a safe place. Kids play here. Like, this is no big deal. I'm gonna be okay. And so he tried, to kind of shimmy himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. His heart rate began to rise. It became harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were kind of pushing down on him. And before long, he was becoming overwhelmingly claustrophobic. He just started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard Carl yelling out made their way into this tunnel system and actually saw Carl. When they tried to pull him out, they couldn't get him to move. I mean, he really was totally stuck here. The staff backed out and they called the fire department. They came out and they too could not get Carl out. Carl realized all he could do here was just do his best to stay calm, because this position he was in was really restricting his breathing. Not to mention, the tunnel itself is pressing down on him. It would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. Carl got weaker and weaker and weaker. The instant Carl was out of the tunnel, he was rushed to the nearest hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. He had suffered all these extensive crush injuries. Ultimately, he would die 8 days later from those injuries. This cave system was not like an underground cave system where spelunkers go. No, this was a cave system for kids. It was a kid's play place. All the tunnels and the cave itself was made out of plastic. Adults were told they too could go through those tunnels with their kids. Carl had gone to a birthday party for one of his kids' friends. He had brought his kids along, and being the devoted father that he was, he went right in there with his kids and was crawling all around and goofing around with the kids until, unfortunately, he got stuck.
There is already tons of shocking content on the internet. There is something truly insane about Wu Yongning's videos. In 2017, Wu was a 26-year-old climbing enthusiast who was dubbed China's first rooftopper. Rooftoppers really need to push the envelope if they want to stand out, and Wu Yongning did just that. The internet rewarded him with millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of dollars. He would dangle over the edge of the building and he would do pull-ups until he reached muscle failure and then would barely be able to pull himself back up to safety. He would go to the top of these huge buildings and he would do a handstand and then he would pull one arm back and then he would tilt his body over the edge until he couldn't do it any farther and he'd let himself come back over to safety. The most difficult to watch was when Wu would use a self-balancing scooter and go as fast as he could right to the edge of the building and stop just short without any safety equipment and without anybody there to potentially pull him back up if he gets stuck. On one video sharing site alone, he had made over $80,000 just from donations that had come in. It was clear this was becoming a career. In early November of that year, Wu heard about a competition that was offering $15,000 to its winner. It was a viral video competition. Make the most viral video and you win the prize. This competition served as motivation for Wu to finally attempt his craziest stunt yet. He figured if he had the footage of this particular stunt, he was sure to win this competition. He could pay for his wedding and cover his mother's medical expenses. On November 8th, Wu traveled to the Huaiyan International Center in central China. This massive 62-story skyscraper would be the tallest building Wu had ever performed a stunt on. The public was only able to get up to the 44th floor, and so Wu had to take the elevator up to somewhere between the 40th and 44th floor, at which point he climbed out of a window and free climbed his way all the way up to the top. Once he got to the rooftop, he set up his tripod and his camera, and he turned on his live stream. Live stream viewers that tuned in would see Wu sitting on the edge of the skyscraper, and he's meticulously wiping down the edge of this building. After several minutes, he begins to lower himself where his arms are still tucked up over the ledge. He's like testing the edge of this lip. You can tell that it's not a good grip. He pulls himself back up. He goes back to wiping down the edge. It seems like Wu is actually pretty nervous about this stunt. And normally he doesn't seem nervous at all, but this one just seemed different. So after wiping down this ledge, he gets himself ready, lowers himself onto his arms, he lets his legs drop over the edge of the building, and then he goes to full extension. And from there, he does 2 complete pull-ups, and then after the second pull-up, he begins to try to pull himself back up to safety. But he's fatigued. He starts to use his feet to try to use the glass to push himself back up, but he can't get a grip. And for the next 15 seconds, Wu is trying to muscle himself up. He did free climb almost 20 stories to get up there. There's nobody up there to help pull him up. He goes back to full extension, and he looks down as if he's sizing up if he can survive this fall. And then he loses his grip, and he falls to his death.
In 2009, a 38-year-old man was sitting inside of a manga cafe in Seoul, South Korea. A manga cafe is a lot like a normal cafe. They have these big in-store libraries that contain manga, and manga are like comic books. This man did not have a lot of money. He didn't buy any drinks or food. He just went up to the in-store library, grabbed an edition of his favorite manga series, and just sat down and began to read. This man had read this particular series multiple times. He just kept coming back to it because he thought it was the best manga you could possibly read. A lot of people didn't know what to make of this particular series because it was so over-the-top violent, well beyond any other series. But to this man, that sort of made it stand out. Every time he read it, it allowed him to sort of leave his life for a second and just totally escape into this wild, violent story. And right now, in this man's life, he really needed that escape. He had spent practically his whole life studying and working to try to become a professional writer and director. This man had successfully landed a couple of jobs here and there, but they were small gigs. He found himself back in the same position he always was in, unemployed. Recently, the man had to sell his laptop just so that they wouldn't get evicted. And if that wasn't bad enough, the man had also begun taking out all these short-term loans with high interest rates just to pay for basic needs, but he had no way to pay them back. So the debt was just piling up nonstop. He took his favorite manga booth, he sat back and just allowed himself to get sucked into the story. As he was reading this manga book, he suddenly has this epiphany. What if I write a story that's inspired by this manga series? So before long, he had put the manga book aside, got a pen and some paper, and just began writing down some ideas for this new story he was going to try to write. And by the time the cafe was closing, he had this amazing outline, and he just knew this was the thing that was going to break him out of poverty and officially make him a successful writer. Several months later, this man had transformed that amazing outline into a fully realized project, and then he went out to try to sell it. Every buyer he went to hated it. They told him, this is simply too weird and way too violent. And the man was sort of crushed because to him it was so clear. This story is so good. People that have experienced real poverty, who understand the lengths that people will go to make money when they're desperate, they'll relate to this. But then, sort of out of left field, 10 years later, a major production studio actually said, you know what? This looks pretty good. We will buy it. This man's story was converted into a TV show, and it premiered in 2021. And when this TV show aired, it became the most talked about show anywhere in every corner of the internet. It also made the production company that bought this story $900 million. And the man who actually wrote the story, he also got paid very well, and he won an Emmy. The manga series that this man read was called Battle Royale, and in this series, these students are forced to fight to the death by a fascist government. He combined that concept with poverty. The writer's name was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and the name of this TV series was Squid Game. One morning in October of 2015, a receptionist sat at her desk at a sports medicine center in Birmingham, Alabama, and scrolled through her boss's upcoming surgery schedule on her computer. The receptionist worked for a famous orthopedic surgeon named Dr. James Andrews, and because of his notoriety, his schedule was typically packed. And so the next person up to get surgery by Dr. Andrews was this minor league baseball player whose name was Brady Feigl, and he was having an elbow surgery, and he was supposed to come in the following morning. So the receptionist called the number on file for Brady, but it actually wasn't Brady's phone number. It was Brady's baseball team's athletic trainer. And the receptionist says, hey, just so you know, Brady has a surgery tomorrow morning. It's his elbow surgery. The trainer just kind of paused for a second. And then the trainer said to the receptionist, there's got to be a mistake here because Brady already had that surgery. He said Brady had gotten it done 6 months earlier. And as a result of the surgery, had to sit out basically the entire baseball season. But the receptionist, as she's hearing this, she's like, no, that doesn't make any sense because the receptionist actually remembered Brady Feigl. He had come in recently for his consultation for this elbow surgery, and he was a really unique looking guy. I mean, he's 6'4", he had bright red hair, a big beard, and also he is a professional baseball player. And so the receptionist is like, no, like he came in recently for his consultation. The receptionist and the trainer started going back and forth, kind of trying to describe Brady Feigl to make sure they both were talking about the same person. But of course they were. They couldn't both be right, but they couldn't understand how this could be possible. But the explanation for this that they did eventually figure out, you just have to see to believe. It would turn out the receptionist and the trainer were both right. Dr. James Andrews was scheduled to perform an elbow surgery on a 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded minor league pitcher named Brady Feigl the following morning. And Dr. James Andrews had also performed the same surgery on another 6'4", red-haired, big-bearded Brady Feigl, who also was a minor league baseball player, also a pitcher, who hurt his elbow months earlier. There were literally two Brady Feigls that didn't know each other, that looked the same, did the same sort of really unique job, minor league baseball player, that also went to the same clinic to get the same surgery at roughly the same time, but somehow or another, the clinic put the wrong contact information for the wrong Brady because they confused them, because they look exactly the same, and they have the same name, and they're getting the same surgery. And so it was not until this surgery mix-up that the two Brady Feigls learned the other existed. They did not know each other. And when they met each other, I mean, they're spitting images of each other. But believe it or not, they did do a DNA test because they're thinking we've got to be related, right? Nope, they're not related. They are just absolutely perfect doppelgangers.